I want you to think back to the last time you saw those blue lights in your rearview mirror. Maybe it was a quick glance, a flicker of anxiety, or that sudden tightening in your chest. Now I want you to add one more layer to that scenario. Imagine that in that moment, as the officer approaches your window, you absolutely know that there is a firearm in the vehicle. Maybe it is in the glove box, maybe under the seat, or maybe it is secured in a case in the back. The question is not whether you are breaking the law, because you might be perfectly legal. The question is, when that officer asks you, and they will ask you, do you know exactly what to say? Do you know that the wrong sentence, the wrong gesture, or even the wrong pause could turn a routine traffic stop into a life-altering event? I have spent years studying the intersection of travel, personal rights, and the reality of law enforcement encounters. And I can tell you that this is the single most misunderstood moment for legal gun owners in America today. So, before we go any further, I need you to answer a question for yourself, and honestly, I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. If an officer walks up to your car and asks, "Is there any reason I should know about that there might be a weapon in the car?" Do you immediately volunteer the information, or do you wait for a more specific question? Think about your answer, write it down in the comments, because the answer you give right now might reveal exactly how much risk you are actually willing to take. Hold that thought, because we are going to dig so deep into this topic that by the end you are going to look at every traffic stop, every checkpoint, and every encounter with law enforcement through a completely different lens. I want you to stick with me for this entire discussion, because what we are covering is not just legal theory. This is about the practical, street-level reality of how officers think, how their training works, and how the law actually applies when your heart is pounding and your hands are shaking. There is a reason why some people walk away from these stops with a warning and a wave, and why others end up handcuffed on the curb, and it rarely has to do with whether they were legally carrying. It has to do with the dance, the verbal and nonverbal dance that starts the second that officer decides to walk up to your door. Let me start by painting a picture for you that is far too common. You are driving home from a weekend trip. You have your firearm in the center console because you were traveling through areas where you felt you needed quick access. You have a valid concealed carry permit. You are not a criminal. You made a mistake, maybe you rolled through a stop sign, or maybe your taillight is out. You see the lights, you pull over, and you immediately start thinking about the gun. Your mind is racing. Should I grab my wallet out of the glove box? The glove box where the gun is? Should I keep my hands on the wheel? What if he asks me to step out? In that moment of panic, the officer arrives. He asks for your license and registration. You freeze. You do not want to reach for the glove box because you know what is in there, but you also do not want to seem hesitant or uncooperative. So you say something. You say, "Officer, I have to tell you, I have a gun in the car." And just like that, the dynamic shifts. The officer's hand goes to his holster, his eyes narrow. He tells you to keep your hands on the wheel, and now you are in a high-alert situation that could have gone completely differently. Now here's the part that most people get wrong. They think that saying, "I have a gun," is the safest and most honest thing to do. And in some states, in some jurisdictions, that might be true. But the reality of human psychology and officer training tells a different story. When you blurt out that you have a weapon, you have just introduced a variable that the officer was not prepared for. He was expecting a routine traffic stop. He was expecting to write a ticket or give a warning. Now he has to deal with the unknown. Is this person a good guy with a permit? Is this person about to do something stupid? The officer does not know you. He does not know that you are a responsible citizen who just wants to get home safely. He knows that people lie, and he knows that every year, officers are killed during traffic stops. So when you say gun, his brain goes to the worst-case scenario. That is not because he is a bad guy. That is because his survival instinct just kicked in. This is where we have to separate the legal obligation from the tactical reality. Legally, in most states, you are not required to spontaneously announce that you have a firearm. The law usually requires you to inform the officer only if they ask. And even then, the phrasing of the question matters immensely. If an officer asks, "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" you have a legal obligation to answer truthfully. Lying to a police officer is a crime in itself, and it destroys your credibility instantly. But if the officer asks, "Where are you headed tonight?" or "Do you know why I pulled you over?" you are not legally required to volunteer information about a firearm. This is the gray area where most people get themselves into trouble. They feel this overwhelming urge to confess, to explain, to justify their existence, and they end up creating a problem where none existed. I remember reading about a case down in Florida a few years back. A guy was pulled over for speeding. He had a firearm in the car. When the officer approached, the guy immediately said, "I have a gun in the glove box." The officer asked him to retrieve it. The guy reached slowly. The officer yelled. The guy panicked, and suddenly he was on the ground with a knee in his back. He was not a criminal. He was just a guy who thought he was doing the right thing by being honest. The charges were eventually dropped, but the trauma, the legal fees, the time spent in jail overnight, that stays with you. And it all could have been avoided if he had simply waited for the officer to ask the right question. Now, I am not telling you to be deceptive. I am telling you to be smart. There's a massive difference between hiding something and simply not offering unsolicited information. Think of it like this. If you are walking down the street and a stranger asks you what time it is, you do not immediately tell them your life story. You answer the question. The same principle applies here, but with much higher stakes. Your job during a traffic stop is to be calm, compliant, and clear. Your job is not to manage the officer's anxiety by guessing what he wants to know. Let him lead the conversation. Let him ask the questions. If he asks about weapons, you answer truthfully, and you tell him exactly where it is and what you want to do next. Officer, I do have a firearm in the glove box. It is not loaded, or it is secured, or I have a permit. I am going to keep my hands on the wheel. How would you like me to proceed? That is a professional, respectful, and safe response. It acknowledges the reality, it shows you are cooperative, and it puts the ball in his court to direct the situation safely. But let us rewind a second. Before you even get to the point of speaking, there is the physical aspect. This is where travelers and everyday drivers make the biggest mistake. They start moving. They reach for the glove box before the officer gets to the window. They reach under the seat to stash something. They move around in the car. To an officer walking up to that car, movement is a threat. They cannot see what your hands are doing. If you are reaching under the seat, for all they know, you are grabbing a weapon to ambush them. So rule number 1, the absolute most critical rule, is hands on the wheel. Put them at 10 and 2, or keep them visible on the steering wheel. If it is dark, turn on the interior dome light. This signals to the officer that you are aware of their presence and you are not a threat. It is a sign of respect, and it lowers the tension immediately. Now, here is a controversial take that I want you to consider. Some people believe that if you have a firearm in the car, you should hand over your concealed carry permit along with your license and registration. The thinking is that it shows the officer up front that you are a permitted, vetted individual. I've gone back and forth on this for years. On one hand, it is a proactive way to disclose that you are legally allowed to carry. On the other hand, it can startle an officer who now has to process that you have a permit and might have a gun. I have spoken to officers who say they appreciate the heads up, and I have spoken to officers who say it makes them more alert because now they know there is a gun in the car. My personal opinion, based on watching hundreds of body cam videos and talking to defense attorneys, is that you should not hand over the permit unless the officer asks for it. Handing over your license and registration is standard. Handing over a permit is unusual, and unusual things can spike an officer's suspicion. If the officer runs your license, they will likely see that you have a permit anyway. The system often flags it, so let the system do its job. Do not introduce a surprise. Let us talk about the scenario where you are traveling across state lines. This is a huge topic for anyone who drives. The laws change dramatically from state to state. You might be legal in your home state, but if you cross into a state that does not recognize your permit, or worse, a state with strict gun laws like New York or New Jersey, you are in a completely different ballgame. In those states, having a firearm in the car might be a felony if it is not stored in a specific way, like unloaded and locked in a container separate from ammunition. If you get pulled over in one of those states, your primary goal is to avoid self-incrimination. You do not want to volunteer that you have a gun if the very possession of that gun is illegal under state law. This is a nightmare scenario. If you are traveling through restrictive states, you need to know the law before you cross the border. You need to know if your firearm must be unloaded, if it must be in the trunk, and if ammunition must be separate. Ignorance is not a defense, and a traffic stop in a hostile jurisdiction can ruin your life. I want to dig into the psychology of the officer for a moment because this is something that is rarely discussed in the usual Know Your Rights videos. Police officers are human beings. They have bad days. They have biases. They have fears. When they approach a car, they are running a risk assessment in their head. They are looking at your car, your license plate, your behavior, your appearance, and the neighborhood. They are making a split-second judgment about whether you are a threat. Your job is to disrupt that negative risk assessment. You want to project an image of predictability and calm. Erratic movements, sweating profusely, avoiding eye contact, talking too much. These are all red flags to an officer. They signal that you have something to hide, even if that something is just anxiety. So you have to control your physiological response. Take a deep breath before the officer gets to the window. Remind yourself that this is a transaction. You are going to provide information, you are going to be polite, and you are going to be on your way. The more you can normalize the situation in your mind, the more normal you will appear to the officer. There is a specific phrase that I have heard defense attorneys recommend, and I think it is worth its weight in gold. If the officer asks you to step out of the vehicle, which they are legally allowed to do for their safety, you should comply. But before you open the door, you say something like, "Officer, I want you to know that I am lawfully armed. I am not going to reach for anything. I am just going to step out as you requested." This does a few things. It informs him of the presence of a weapon without it being a surprise. It tells him that you are compliant and understand the situation. And it reassures him that you are not about to make a grab for the gun. If you step out of the car and the officer sees a bulge on your hip or a weapon in the car that he was not expecting, you have just created a moment of panic. You want to control the narrative. You want him to know before he sees it. Now, let us address the elephant in the room. What if you are in a state with a duty to inform? There are about a dozen or so states that have laws requiring you to notify an officer immediately upon contact that you are carrying a firearm. In those states, if you do not inform, you can lose your permit or face criminal charges. This changes the game entirely. If you are in a duty to inform state, you cannot wait for the question. You have to speak up. But even then, you do it the right way. You do not shout, "I have a gun," as the officer approaches. You wait until he is at the window, you keep your hands on the wheel, and you say, "Officer, before you ask, I want to let you know that I have a concealed carry permit and I am currently carrying a firearm. It is location. How would you like me to proceed?" This is respectful, it is legal, and it is safe. The key is the phrasing. You are not making a demand. You are providing information and asking for instructions. That puts the officer in a position of control, which is where they want to be, and it makes them feel safer. I have seen too many people ruin their lives because they thought they could talk their way out of a situation. They start explaining why they have the gun, where they are going, why they are traveling, and they end up saying something incriminating. "Oh, I have it because the neighborhood I am going to is rough." That sounds like you are anticipating trouble, which might make the officer think you are looking for it. Or they say, "I forgot it was in there." That sounds like you are not responsible enough to know where your firearm is. The less you say, the better. Answer the questions directly, honestly, and briefly. Do not embellish, do not justify, do not argue. If you disagree with the reason for the stop, you fight that in court, not on the side of the road. On the side of the road, you only have one goal: to end the encounter safely and quickly. Let us talk about a scenario that is terrifying for a lot of people. You are pulled over, and the officer asks you to get out. You get out, and then he says, "I am going to pat you down for weapons." This is a frisk, legally known as a Terry stop frisk. If the officer has reasonable suspicion that you are armed and dangerous, he can pat you down for weapons. If you are carrying a concealed firearm, that pat down is going to find it. Now, if you have already informed him that you are armed, this is a non-event. He knows it is there, you have already told him, and he will likely just secure it for the duration of the stop. But if you did not inform him because you were in a state without a duty to inform, and he finds it during a pat-down, you have a problem. Not a legal problem necessarily, because you might be perfectly legal, but you have a trust problem. The officer now thinks you were trying to hide it. He thinks you were being deceptive. And once that trust is broken, the stop becomes adversarial. He is going to look harder for other violations. He is going to be less likely to give you a break. So this is the risk you run by staying silent. You have to weigh the risk of creating anxiety by announcing it versus the risk of destroying trust by having it discovered. This is why I always recommend that people practice what they are going to say. It sounds silly, but rehearsing a simple script in your head can make all the difference when your adrenaline is spiking. You want the words to come out automatically. You do not want to be fumbling for the right thing to say when the officer is staring at you. You want to be able to say calmly and clearly, "I have a firearm in the vehicle. I have a permit. I am not reaching for it." That is it. That is the magic sentence. It covers the facts, it shows compliance, and it removes the unknown. Now let us get into the aftermath of the stop. Once the officer has your documents and the weapon situation is resolved, he is going to go back to his car and run your information. This is the waiting period. This is where people get nervous and start doing dumb things. They start talking to themselves. They start reaching for their phone. They start digging in the glove box for insurance. Do not do any of that. Wait. Keep your hands visible. If you need to reach for something, wait for the officer to return and ask permission. "Officer, my insurance card is in the glove box. May I reach for it?" This shows respect and keeps the interaction predictable. There is a cultural aspect to this that we have to address, and it is uncomfortable, but it is real. The reality of policing in America is that race, location, and the type of car you drive all factor into how an encounter goes. A white man in a suit driving a sedan in a suburb is going to have a different experience than a young black man in a hoodie driving a modified car in a high-crime area. That is just the truth. If you fall into a demographic that is more likely to be profiled, your behavior needs to be even more precise. You cannot afford to be ambiguous. You cannot afford to be slow to comply. You have to be a model of cooperation because the margin for error is thinner. It is not fair, but fairness is not something you can rely on in a traffic stop. You have to rely on strategy. You have to rely on de-escalation. You have to rely on making sure that the officer has absolutely no reason to be suspicious of you beyond the initial reason for the stop. I want to share a story from a friend of mine who is a retired state trooper. He told me about a stop he made late one night. He pulled over a car with an out-of-state plate for speeding. As he approached, he saw the driver and a passenger, both men, sitting perfectly still, hands on the dash. He said that immediately, his threat level dropped. He knocked on the window, and the driver said, "Officer, I want you to know there is a registered firearm in the center console. It is secured, and we are not going to touch it. Here are my license and registration." My friend said it was the smoothest stop he ever had. He checked the guy's permit, verified the gun was legal, wrote him a warning for the speed, and sent him on his way in less than 10 minutes. He told me, "If everyone handled it like that, we would have a lot fewer problems." That is the goal. You want to be the easiest stop of that officer's day. Now let us flip the script. What happens if you are a passenger in a car that gets pulled over and you are carrying? This is a tricky one. Legally, you are not the driver, so you are not interacting with the officer directly at first. But if the officer sees something suspicious, or if he asks everyone in the car for identification, you are now part of the encounter. If you are carrying and the officer asks you to step out, you have the same responsibility to inform, depending on the state laws. But you have to be careful not to interrupt the driver's interaction with the officer. You wait. You keep your hands visible. If the officer addresses you directly, you follow the same protocol. "Officer, I am a permitted carrier and I have a firearm on my person in my bag. I am not reaching for it. How would you like me to proceed?" Do not shout this across the car while the officer is talking to the driver. Wait until he speaks to you. One of the biggest fears people have is that the officer will take their firearm. And yes, officers can and will temporarily seize a firearm for the duration of a stop if they feel it is necessary for safety. They might ask you to step out, and then they will retrieve the weapon from the car or from your holster and secure it on the trunk or in their own vehicle until the stop is over. This is legal. It is annoying, but it is legal. The key is to not resist. Let them take it. Arguing about it on the side of the road is a losing battle. You can deal with the return of the property after the stop is over. If they forget to give it back, you can ask politely, "Officer, may I have my firearm back before I leave?" Usually they will return it. If they don't, you have a process to go through to retrieve it from the police department, which is a hassle, but it is better than being arrested for obstructing. We also have to talk about the use of technology. More and more people have dash cams. Some people even wear body cams. This can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, it records the encounter and can protect you if the officer acts improperly. On the other hand, if you have a camera rolling, you need to inform the officer if your state requires consent for recording. In many states, you can record in public without consent, but a traffic stop is a tricky area. My advice is to have a camera, but do not be obvious about it. Do not wave it in the officer's face. Do not say, "I'm recording you." That immediately puts them on the defensive. Let it run quietly. If things go sideways, you have evidence. But if you are respectful, it should never come to that. I want to get into the weeds on the legal concept of reasonable suspicion because it is central to why an officer might ask about guns in the first place. An officer cannot just walk up to your car and ask, "Do you have any guns?" without some basis. They can ask, but you do not have to answer unless they have reasonable suspicion that a crime is occurring. However, and this is a big however, during a traffic stop, the officer has the right to ask questions related to the stop. They can ask where you are going and where you are coming from. Those are routine. If, based on your answers or something they see, they develop reasonable suspicion that you are involved in criminal activity, they can then ask more pointed questions, including about weapons. This is where your answers matter. If you say you are coming from a city known for gun violence and going to another city known for gun violence, and you are nervous, that might give them suspicion. Again, you do not want to lie, but you also do not want to feed their suspicion. You want to give the most boring, bland answers possible. I'm coming from the grocery store. I'm going home. That is it. You do not need to tell them about your trip to visit your aunt who lives in a rough neighborhood. There is a scenario that I want you to think about that is very specific to travelers. You are on a long road trip. You have camping gear, luggage, and your firearm is packed deep in a bag in the back. You get pulled over. You know the gun is there, but it is not accessible. Do you still have to tell the officer? Again, it depends on the state. In a duty to inform state, yes, you have to tell them. In other states, you might not have to. But think about the logistics. If you tell them it is in a bag in the back, they might ask you to retrieve it, which means you have to get out, open the trunk, dig through your luggage, and hand them a firearm. That is a lot of movement and a lot of potential for something to go wrong. Alternatively, if you do not tell them and they ask to search the car, they might find it anyway. There is no perfect answer here. You have to use your judgment. My personal feeling is that if the gun is truly inaccessible and you are in a state without a duty to inform, it is safer to simply not mention it unless asked directly. The officer is not going to see it, and it poses no immediate threat to them. But if there is any chance the officer will see it, or if you are in a state where you have to inform, you must speak up. Let me tell you about a mistake I see over and over again in body cam footage. The officer asks, "Do you have any weapons in the car?" And the driver says, "No." Then a few minutes later, the officer sees a shell casing on the floor or a gun case in the back seat. Now the officer knows the driver lied. Even if the gun is not there, the lie is enough to destroy any chance of leniency. The driver will say, "Oh, I forgot about that," or "That's my old case, there's no gun." It does not matter. The trust is broken. The officer now assumes the driver is hiding something and will push for a search. So, if you are going to say no, you better be absolutely certain there is not a single gun-related item in that car. Not a shell, not a holster, not a case, not a receipt from a gun store. Because if they see it, you are in a world of trouble. Now I want to touch on something that is rarely discussed: the psychological impact of these encounters. Even if you do everything right, even if you are polite and compliant and you walk away with a warning, you might feel shaken. You might feel violated. You might replay the conversation in your head for days, wondering if you said the wrong thing. That is normal. A traffic stop is an involuntary detention. You are not free to leave. That feeling of powerlessness is real. It is important to process that. Talk to someone about it. Write it down. But do not let it turn into anger that affects your driving or your attitude. If you carry a gun, you have a responsibility to be a calming influence, not a source of conflict. Your gun is for self-defense, not for ego. It is not for making you feel tough. It is a tool, and with that tool comes the responsibility to avoid situations where it might be used, including situations where an officer's fear could escalate. We also have to consider the possibility that the officer is wrong. Maybe you did nothing wrong, and the stop is unjustified. Maybe the officer is having a bad day and is being rude. Maybe you feel like your rights are being trampled. In that moment, you have to make a choice. Do you assert your rights loudly and risk escalating the situation, or do you comply and fight it later? My advice, and this is coming from years of watching people make bad decisions, is to comply and fight later. Do not argue on the side of the road. Do not refuse to sign the ticket. Do not tell the officer he is an idiot. All of that does is increase the chances that you get arrested, or worse, that you get hurt. If the officer is conducting an illegal search, you say, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." That is it. You say it once, calmly. Then you comply. You do not physically resist. You let them do what they are going to do, and then your lawyer tears them apart in court. That is the smart play. That is the safe play. I want to get into the specifics of how to store a firearm in a vehicle to minimize complications during a stop. If you have a console safe or a glove box safe, that is ideal. It shows that you are a responsible owner who is taking steps to secure the weapon. If the officer asks about it, you can say, "It is secured in a locked safe." That might reduce his concern because he knows it is not readily accessible. If you have it in a holster on your person, that is different. That is accessible. That is something the officer will want to deal with immediately. If you have it in the door pocket or under the seat, that is a bad idea. It is not secure, it is easy to grab, and it looks bad to the officer. Think about how you store it. Think about how that storage will look to someone who is peering into your car with a flashlight. Let us talk about the scenario where you are pulled over at night. Night stops are inherently more dangerous for officers and for you. The officer cannot see into the car as well. He is more on edge. In this situation, your actions need to be amplified. Turn on that dome light before he gets to the window. Roll down all the windows if you have tinted windows. Make it as easy as possible for him to see inside. If you have a firearm and you are in a state where you need to inform, you do it the same way, but you might add, I am going to keep my hands on the wheel so you can see them. The visibility factor is huge. You want to eliminate any shadows, any ambiguity. There is a concept in law enforcement called officer safety. It is the mantra that justifies almost every action they take during a stop. They can order you out of the car for officer safety. They can pat you down for officer safety. They can search the immediate area for weapons for officer safety. Once you understand that everything they do is filtered through that lens, you can start to predict their behavior. They are not thinking about your rights. They are thinking about going home at the end of their shift. So when you interact with them, you have to address that underlying fear. You have to show them that you are not a threat to their safety. That is why keeping your hands visible is so important. That is why telling them about the gun in a calm, controlled manner is so important. You are de-escalating their fear. Now, I want to go back to that opening question. If an officer asks you, is there any reason I should know about that there might be a weapon in the car? That is a broad, fishing question. They are not asking directly if you have a gun. They are asking if there is a reason they should know about. Some people might interpret that as a trick question. Legally, you are only required to answer direct questions truthfully. You are not required to interpret what they mean. If you answer no, and they later find a gun, they will argue that you lied. But a good defense attorney would argue that the question was vague, and you answered it truthfully because there was no reason for them to know, as the gun was legal. This is a legal gray area. My personal advice is to treat it as a direct question. If you have a gun, you should say yes. Why? Because if you say no and they find it, you are in a he said, she said situation that you will likely lose. It is better to err on the side of disclosure when the question is that close to the line. I have spent a lot of time talking about what you should do, but let me also talk about what you should never do. Never, ever reach for your wallet or your documents if the gun is in the same location. This is a huge problem. People keep their gun in the glove box and their registration in the glove box. So when the officer asks for registration, they have to open the compartment where the gun is. This is a recipe for disaster. You need to plan ahead. Keep your documents somewhere separate from your firearm. Keep them in your pocket, in the visor, in the center console if the gun is not there. You want to be able to retrieve your documents without touching or even looking at the area where the gun is stored. If you absolutely have to go into the glove box where the gun is, you must tell the officer first. Officer, my registration is in the glove box. The glove box also contains my firearm. I'm going to reach in slowly and get the documents. Is that okay? This gives him the chance to tell you not to, and he might retrieve it himself. That is fine. That is safe. Another thing you should never do is lie about your permit. If you have a permit, you have it. If you do not, you do not. Do not claim you have one if you don't. That is a crime. Do not say you forgot it if you never had one. The officer will run your name and find out the truth. Lying just makes you look like a criminal. Let us talk about the aftermath of a stop where things went wrong. Maybe you were arrested, maybe your gun was confiscated. The first thing you do is shut up. Do not talk to the officers at the station. Do not explain yourself. Do not try to be friendly. You ask for a lawyer. That is your right. Use it. The moment you are in custody, anything you say can and will be used against you. The officers might seem friendly. They might say, just tell us what happened and we can clear this up. That is a trap. They are trying to get you to admit to something. Do not fall for it. Be polite, but firm. I want a lawyer. Say it over and over again until they stop asking. I want to bring this back to the traveling aspect, because that is the core of our discussion. When you travel, you are often in unfamiliar territory. You do not know the local police culture. You do not know if the department is known for being aggressive or reasonable. You do not know the local laws as well as you should. This adds a layer of complexity. My advice for travelers is to do a deep dive on the laws of every state you will pass through. Print out the relevant statutes and keep them in the car. I know that sounds excessive, but if you are pulled over and you are unsure, having that information can help. It also shows the officer that you are a serious, law-abiding citizen who has done their homework. There is also the issue of reciprocity. Just because your home state honors your permit does not mean the state you are in honors it. You need to know that before you cross the border. If you are in a state that does not recognize your permit, you are essentially carrying illegally. That changes everything. In that scenario, you do not want to volunteer that you have a gun. You want to pray that the officer does not ask and does not find it. If they do ask, you have to tell the truth. And then you are facing a potential arrest. This is why planning your route is so important. You can avoid states that do not honor your permit. You can take the long way around. It is worth the extra driving time to avoid a felony charge. I have been doing this research for a long time, and one thing that consistently amazes me is how many people think that having a permit makes them immune to the law. It does not. A permit allows you to carry. It does not allow you to be rude, to resist, or to ignore the officer's commands. It does not give you a pass. In fact, it raises the stakes because you are expected to know better. You are supposed to be the responsible one, so act like it. Let me tell you about a specific case that haunts me. A guy was driving through a state where he had a permit. He got pulled over for a broken taillight. He had his gun in the center console. When the officer asked for his documents, he reached for the console. The officer saw the gun, yelled, and the guy instinctively grabbed it. He later said he was just trying to move it so he could get his wallet, but the officer saw it as a threat. The guy was shot. He survived, but he is paralyzed, all because he did not tell the officer beforehand. If he had just said, "My wallet is in the console next to my gun, let me show you," that officer would have been prepared. He would have told him to stop, and they would have figured it out. But the surprise, the sudden movement, it triggered a fatal response. That is the reality we live in. You cannot control how the officer will react, but you can control the information you give them. You can eliminate the surprise. We have to talk about the role of the passenger. If you are a passenger and you see the driver making a mistake, what do? Do you speak up? Do you stay quiet? It is a tough spot. If the driver is about to reach into a compartment with a gun without telling the officer, you might have to say something. You might say, "Officer, I think he keeps his wallet in there, but there is also a gun in there." That might save everyone from a tragic misunderstanding, but it also might make the driver angry. You have to weigh the risk. In my opinion, safety trumps embarrassment. If you see a dangerous situation developing, you speak up. I want to get into the technicalities of the Fourth Amendment for a minute because it is relevant. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. During a traffic stop, the officer can order you out of the car. That is settled law. They can also frisk you if they have reasonable suspicion you are armed, but they cannot search your car without probable cause or your consent. This is why you should never consent to a search. If the officer asks, "Do you mind if I take a look around?" you say, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." That is your right. They might search anyway if they have probable cause, but by withholding consent, you preserve your right to challenge the search later. If you consent, you have no recourse. Now, if you have a gun in the car and the officer has probable cause to believe you are involved in a crime, they might search the car. If they find the gun and it is legal, it might not be a problem unless you are in a state where it is illegal. But if they find it because of a search that was illegal, your lawyer can get the evidence thrown out. This is why the "do not consent" line is so important. It creates a record that you did not waive.